every time I find evidence of a massive forthcoming event to take away a little bit of our freedom here and there under the guise of improving our health or our safety or our security, I am going to warn you about it, because the ultimate end game is to take away your freedom. And so now we have a book by a woman named Tracy McMillan, The American Way of Eating, which has, according to the New York Times, as its premise that only the fancy and the snobs get good food. What is it with all of these young, single white women? Overeducated doesn't mean intelligent.
Joining us now exclusively for the interview is Tracy McMillan for her very first interview since she was attacked by Rush Limbaugh all day long for doing nothing wrong but for being a woman while doing it. Ms. McMillan is the author of this new book, The American Way of Eating, Undercover at Walmart, Applebee's, Farm Fields, and the Dinner Table. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's nice to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
In the wake of the Sandra Fluke controversy with Mr. Limbaugh, which has gotten all this national attention, I imagine you had no clue at all that he would spend today on his show going after you for hours.
I had absolutely no clue, and I actually almost missed it. I'm on deadline for a reported piece, and so yesterday I was about to shut off the internet for the day so I could get some work done. And then a few emails and tweets sort of came in, and I said, I need to take a look at this. And it was about an hour before we figured out he had spent, I think it was like a half hour, 45 minutes talking about my book and reading the New York Times interview on air. So it was a very interesting surprise.
It is. That's an interesting detail about this, is that Mr. Limbaugh does not seem to be angry about your book. When he did this on his show yesterday, he seemed to be angry about a positive New York Times article about your book. And it's an article that came out 2 weeks ago. Is that right?
Yeah, so the book came out 2 weeks ago, and the Times review came out the same day as it was published, so that's February 21st. I think that Rush said in his broadcast that, I've been holding on to this for a couple weeks. So I guess he thought it was really important that he warn everybody that, somebody was talking to working Americans about food.
Well, I mean, the way that he works, part of his shtick is that he's going after you personally, attacking you for being overeducated and single and white and all of these things.
Right.
But he's doing that. He doesn't know you from Adam, and so he's doing that as a way of undermining the cause of what you represent and what the book represents. What do you think it is about your reporting on the food industry and the American way of eating that he finds so appalling, and from the way he was attacking you, anti-conservative or anti-freedom?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's sort of a couple ways to respond, right? Like, one is just to be sort of very flip about it and be like, well, I write about food, and food's obviously very important to Rush, so maybe that's part of his concern here. But, if I'm going to engage more directly with that, it's a little bit weird, right? Because mostly what I did is I went and I did my job, right? I went and I worked as a farm worker in California. I worked at a Walmart outside of Detroit in the grocery section, and I worked at an Applebee's in New York, and I wrote about what food is like for people in those jobs, and and did what reporters do, which is I went and talked to people and gathered information and tried to explain what's going on. And I think probably what's most confusing for somebody like Rush is that I'm from a working class background. I, am from the Midwest. I'm from a rural area. And, I'm part of the working class as much as anybody else is. And I think it's really confusing to all of a sudden have somebody who's from that part of society and can't just be dismissed on these charges of an elitist problem, right? And then I come back and I say, well, I think maybe the private sector isn't meeting all of our needs right now. And I think that that's something that, conservatives don't necessarily have a really good framework for dealing with.
I know that the book, The American Way of Eating, is a reference to one of my favorite works of expository nonfiction, The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford, who's always been one of my heroes. And I was thinking about that. I was also out at the John Steinbeck Center at San Jose State University this past weekend, talking about the way that Steinbeck was writing novels, but he was writing essentially exposés of the way that that Americans were living in his time and things that Americans didn't want to read about our own country. Reading exposés, reading journalism, reading accounts of things that are wrong in the country makes people mad. And when people get angry about hearing that things aren't great in the country, do you think do you have any empathy from where that comes from? Do you think that people don't want to hear bad things about the country because they love the country so much? Or do you have any insight into why it makes people angry to hear bad news about the country?
Well, I think some of it is just that, it's really hard to have people criticize a place that you love and identify with, right? And so I think all of us grow up with this story of all this great opportunity in America, and to see it not being offered to everyone equally, I think on a very basic level, that's upsetting to anybody, right? And at the same time, I think that if you're struggling really hard in your work and your job, it can just be really depressing and draining, right, to hear about how much worse it is for someone else, because it might make you feel like, well, it could be a lot worse than what I have. That makes it really hard to sort of engage with those kinds of stories. So, I've always sort of felt that there's a special kind of anger that you find from like a lot of folks. Often, at least like in my experience, like a lot of the men that I grew up with in the working class in Michigan, right, a lot of white men like grow up being told that they have every opportunity, and yet life is still really, really hard. And I think it can be very difficult to sort of deal with how hard all of that is without feeling like, why is everybody telling me that this is supposed to be so easy? Because it's not. Yeah,
it's about making anger constructive, which is a biblical pursuit as much as a national pursuit in some ways. Tracy McMillan, congratulations on The American Way of Eating. And it feels a little bit weird, but this book is going to, in fact, get a lot more attention, I think, because you've been bizarrely singled out for being who you are doing this work of journalism. And that is a blessing. So I hope it gives you even further luck with the book. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
All right. Right after this show, on The Last Word, one candidate who did very, very, very well in Ohio last night is named Barack Obama. Lawrence has the explanation of that coming up. And still ahead here, Rick Santorum's Google problem and Rick Santorum's new Google problem. Both are, I think, maybe equally problematic, but that's straight ahead.